Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Zero Trust Ransomware Defense. This event is brought to you in partnership with our friends at Rubrik, NetApp, and Blue Hexagon. Thank you so much for joining us on the webinar today. This is going to be a really interesting, really educational presentation with our three experts from Rubrik, NetApp, and Blue Hexagon. So, this is a hot topic, ransomware defense, and we've all heard the buzzword zero trust. You're going to learn a lot about these on the event today. So again, thank you so much for joining us. Before we get started, there's just a few things that you should know about the event. My name is David Davis of Actual Tech Media, and I'll be serving as the moderator. As always, we want these events to be educational. We encourage your questions there in the questions pane, and we'll be doing a live Q&A session at the end of the event, taking your questions. We also have a best question prize, and that's there to help encourage your questions further. So if something's on your mind, ask away. We want to help to solve your challenges in the world of IT, specifically around ransomware. We've got to do whatever we can to protect ourselves from this threat that's just plaguing companies of all shapes and sizes. I also want to call your attention there to a number of handouts in the handouts tab. There are some great resources. There is a guide on modernizing defenses for ransomware. There's a case study about Lang's Building Supplies and how they were attacked with ransomware and how they rapidly recovered. I've seen the video on this myself. There is a video on YouTube as well as this case study, and it's an amazing story of how successful they were in getting their data back rapidly. So I encourage you to check that out. And also a valuable resource there, the best practices guide for preparing and recovering from a ransomware attack. Make sure that you download those PDF assets now. They won't be as readily available after the event, so make sure that you check those out. And then finally, at the end of the webinar today, it's my pleasure to be announcing the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card door prize. If you're watching this on demand, of course, the drawing would have already occurred. The prize terms can be found right there in the handouts tab. And then, as I mentioned, we also have our best question prize for another gift card, an Amazon $50 gift card. Of course, you have to ask a question to be entered into that prize drawing and meet the Actual Tech Media prize terms and conditions. And with that, it's now time to introduce you to today's expert presenters. I'm excited to bring in Mr. Murthy Mathaprekasam, Senior Director of Product Marketing at Rubrik, Randy Damon, Solutions Architect for Data Protection at NetApp, and Dr. Samitra Das, Co-founder and inventor of AI Security at Blue Hexagon. I'm first going to hand it over to you, Murthy. It's great to have you on. Take it away.
Thank you very much, David. Thanks for everybody joining today from the audience here. Again, my name is Murthy Mathaprekasam. I work at Rubrik as part of our cyber resilience team here. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Rubrik, Rubrik is a company that's been around for many years, leader in sort of the data protection space. But most recently, we've been making a lot of really key investments into this notion of zero trust defense and cyber resiliency. So I'm really excited to get a chance to talk to you about some of those new capabilities and how we're helping organizations like yours really address this emerging threat as David sort of introduced here with. So let me just jump right into our slides here and take it away. So I think that, David kind of opened the session in a really effective way. And I just want to address that, the fact that this is really mission critical. And this is one of these things that's rapidly evolved from something that was sort of a nice to have into something that's very much a must-have. There's many reasons for this. Now, obviously, it's a global threat, but you're seeing even government, recognize that this is something that is a critical threat. So this was an alert that was issued by the Biden administration in the United States. You can read the quote there. Basically, the government is putting business on alert. Like, this is something that's really real. We're seeing it grow. And the growth has been motivated by a number of factors that we are all familiar with. Obviously, the work at home kind of context that's been motivated because of the pandemic has just led to a greater threat surface. There's just more data that's spread out, just literally from a physical standpoint. But also there's just, more technologies that the bad guys have adopted as well, in terms of how they can get ransomware into organizations, even a sort of whole economy and supply chain of how these ransomware encryptions are sort of built, developed, distributed. So just many reasons why this threat has gone up, and you can kind of see just the magnitude of that growth. Roughly about a third of organizations were hit with some kind of a ransomware attack last year. That's pretty shocking, right? That's, we've gone from something that was very kind of emerging to a third of organizations being hit in some form of another. So we can expect that to continue to rise. And you can see, like, it's not like a trivial type of a problem. The average cost, and obviously this is looking at a fairly wide span of types of attacks, but you're talking about almost $2 million in loss from any one of these attacks. So it's an important problem, and now's the time to act, because the problem's not going to go away. This is part of our new normal, and it's just a matter of how can organizations meet this risk and achieve a greater level of resilience against them. So there's a lot of different questions organizations need to tackle as part of this, but just to keep things very simple for the purposes of today, I thought there's sort of three big things that really you want to be thinking about. First of all, I think everybody kind of understands that backups are a fairly key part of your cyber resilience strategy. Like, obviously, if your production environment is attacked, number one way to have recoverability from that is to have backups somewhere. But the question is, are the backups themselves prone to attack as well? Because your ability to recover is obviously significantly affected by that. Number two is, it's one thing to have backups, but the backups themselves may have been infected with the ransomware. So can you actually very, very quickly identify which of your backups actually represents the last known good state? Because if you can't, you might actually be just creating a loop that you don't ever get out of. And so another key aspect of recoverability is knowing where the last known good state is. And then finally, it comes down to mean time to recover also, right? In a world where time is money, literally, I mean, a big part of the reason why that nearly $2 million cost, in a lot of these cases, the organization was able to recover. So it's not that they weren't able to recover, but it just took way too long. And there's all kinds of collateral damage that comes from that, whether it's customer, branding impact, regulatory fees, just other kind of operational types of impact. So it's not just a matter of can you recover, but like how quickly are you able to do it as well. So let me talk to you a little bit more detail about kind of these problems and how Rubrik kind of helps to address them. So one of the reasons why this landscape, why we're in this situation right now, is because there's actually been a lot of investments organizations have made in data protection in general. So this isn't like a completely new domain. But the challenge with some of those legacy approaches is that they were sort of designed for a fundamentally different market context. They were just designed for very, very efficient kind of backup infrastructure, so that you can just get data replicated and out to some other kind of secondary storage in a really, really easy way. That's necessary but not sufficient to meet this new threat landscape that we're seeing, right? So the architecture that you kind of see that is very, very good at this sort of high efficiency kind of backup environment, attackers can still kind of get through this, right? They can intercept traffic that can come through any of the data flows that flow over open network protocols. They could potentially just hack the backup server, so then that the backup hasn't actually necessarily provided extra benefit from your production environment. Maybe they can get into the backup software itself, modify retention policies so that you're not actually keeping data beyond it for the level that you actually want to be keeping that data. Number four, they can corrupt the data. They can just go in and start modifying it and making changes to it. And then finally, obviously, the worst thing is that they actually delete the backup files so that there is no way to restore from the backup that you have. So these are all these like kind of threat vectors that weren't really part of the original design for a lot of these legacy approaches to backup. And that's why, despite having this infrastructure, organizations are still facing this threat from the ransomware attacks. So Rubrik has actually kind of thought through this. And the interesting thing was that Rubrik thought about this well before this emerging threat happened, because Rubrik has always been very sort of forward in innovating around the concept of data security and bringing data security and data protection together in a very integrated way. And so we've addressed a lot of these threat vectors by just putting the security into the infrastructure. And here's just a couple of examples of that. So like actually having end-to-end encryption in every single part of the infrastructure. So the data cannot, like you can't sniff the traffic and figure out what the data is. The whole thing is encrypted, right? Number two, it's thinking about like multi-factor authentication, other forms of authentication, so that even getting into the backup like requires, it's like fairly difficult to kind of get in there. Very, very few users who are allowed, and those have to be authenticated. Using things like certificate-based authorization. I mean, some of these are technologies that have been around a long time, but just people haven't thought about applying that to their backup because they never thought of it as something that was fairly critical. All of this is built in with kind of the Rubrik architecture. An immutable, append-only kind of file system so that you can't go in and make unauthorized changes. And we have a whole bunch of sort of data integrity checking that happens in the software as well. So like we can actually prevent data corruption to a very, very high degree. And then finally, there's this sort of notion of unmountability. So the file system can't be taken offline. There's retention locks that make sure that data is kept for a certain period of time without deletion. And so this is just a couple of things that we've implemented. There's a whole bunch of other technologies that are part of what we're calling kind of our frame or point of view around zero trust. Like basically this backup environment is actually fairly important to you now in light of this ransomware threat. And so we need to think through all of the ways that an attacker could affect the backup environment the same way it can affect your production environment. We've done that thinking so that when you invest in Rubrik, your probability of having these types of attacks is nearly zero. So there's this element, of course, of like being prepared for the attack. That's a lot of what this sort of hardening of the backup environment is really about. Like kind of just deter any problems with the backup environment itself. So that's again something that's necessary, but also arguably not sufficient to meet this emerging threat landscape. So beyond that is like at some point it almost becomes a matter of when and not if, right? Just because of the environment that we're in. And so if and when that attack does occur, you also want to be able to respond to it very, very quickly. So once you're in that kind of mode of having to respond to the attack, like the question is, how quickly is that response? And what we found is that actually a lot of organizations, they run like these layers and layers of various security, protection, so to speak, all the way kind of from physical network, all the way to endpoint, but they're still getting attacked by ransomware, right? And so the point is that this is a brand new attack vector that in a lot of ways is actually penetrating through these very legacy approaches to data security, which is why to some extent it is a matter of when and not if. And so you got to think about also what's the response strategy when an attack happens so that you're able to restore back as quickly as possible. So one of the ideas that we've built, given that we're managing the backup infrastructure, and so we actually have some knowledge of the data that sits within the backup environment, is how can we accelerate that mean time to recovery by just looking at the data and understanding it a little bit better so that we can get you back to a clean state as quickly as possible. So some of the technologies that we've built into kind of the Rubrik overall offering is the ability to detect anomalous behavior. So since we're taking snapshots at various points in time, we actually have some sense of understanding of what's changing. And there are certain types of changes that are kind of ones that we know are normal changes. It's what happens over time to the data sets in a regular production environment. Whereas there's other kinds of changes that you can tell are more deliberate. Like there's actually an unauthorized user going in and encrypting files or doing other things which are a lot more deliberate in nature. So we can figure this out, and then we can send alerts around it. We can plug into other security tools, so we can actually let folks know, hey, we got some weird behavior here. You maybe want to go in and take a look at this so you can get ahead of the response a little bit. But if also the infection has occurred, we can also go through and actually analyze the snapshots to see where did the encryption actually happen. Because we have this ability to look at the data over time, we can actually see, well, what point in time did maybe the encryption start? And so if we're going to look at, well, how do we recover? We want to obviously avoid reinfection. So we can go back in time to the point right before the encryption happened, identify that proactively, so that now as an administrator, you're able to actually restore at exactly the right time to avoid the reinfection. That simple task will likely save you hours and maybe even days in your recovery response, because just knowing where to go so that you don't get reinfected with the exact same encryption is very huge. And it's something that takes a lot of time today. Finally, it's also just being able to recover at scale. Rubrik has a very, very sophisticated set of methods for recovering data at the file level, at the application level. We can also instantiate, like in the case of something like VMs, we can instantiate the VMs on the backup server. If you really, really need to get some of these services up and running immediately, instead of having to even wait for it to copy back into the production environment, we can actually temporarily take the backup environment and make it your production. And so there's a whole wide variety of technologies that we have that enable you to get up and running as quickly as possible, so that in the middle of the fire, you're not having to keep systems offline. And that's very, very powerful, because a lot of these attacks, time is money again. And so one of the ways that we can save you money is by saving you time. One other capability that we have, since we actually have access to the information that's in the backup system, is looking for sensitive data. So part of the equation in terms of how you respond to these attacks is knowing what actually potentially got attacked, or what might have been exfiltrated. And the equation changes depending on the sensitivity of the data. If you've got data that kind of doesn't matter as much, that might change the way that you address your response, and even consider whether it's worth paying the ransom. Obviously, that you generally want to avoid paying the ransom, but that equation might change based on knowing what data actually was affected. So if, on the other hand, you had very, very sensitive data, and this is particularly true when you're in healthcare environments, financial services environments, and so on, you might actually consider a different approach to your response. And so because we have access to the data, and we have machine learning that can go through and very, very quickly identify sensitive data, we can give you a much better point of view on the risk that you're facing. And that can inform a lot of your decision making and exactly how you respond to this attack. So that hopefully gives you just a quick overview of some of the technologies that we're bringing to bear to address this emerging threat. And I always like to say, kind of our zero trust architecture is the trusted approach. This just gives you a sample of some of the certifications that we've done around our architecture. A lot of the kind of more common ones that you've probably heard of. But again, it goes back to this idea that security is not an afterthought with Rubrik. We've really thought about security at every single point of the architecture of data protection, so that we're really merging these things in a very, very sophisticated way. And that may have seemed like kind of a premium capability a couple years ago, but in a world of greater ransomware attacks, this is really the only way that you can safely keep data protected, but also make sure that you're able to recover very, very quickly if an attack occurs. So hopefully that was a useful kind of overview of some of the technologies that Rubrik is bringing to bear. And with that, I'm going to hand off to my colleague Randy here from NetApp, and he can tell you a little bit about what they're bringing to bear here as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Murphy. All right, let's talk a little bit about data management within a NetApp data fabric and how some of the pieces tie together between Rubrik and NetApp. So when we take a look at security overall, we need to be aware of a couple of different areas, right? We need to detect when things are happening on our system. We need the ability to protect the data so that we can recover it if we need to. So in the detect area, some of the tools that NetApp brings is the ability to identify end user accounts that may be the victim of a ransomware attack before the attack grows, right? Early detection is critical, is key to stopping the attack from spreading throughout your entire environment. And some of the other tools that we use for that, we can do storage performance monitoring, looking at efficiency loss, things like that. In the protect area, we're really looking to leverage our relationships with partners such as Rubrik to accelerate your backup and your disaster recovery. So if bad things happen, how do we recover very quickly? I'll go into that a little bit in a couple of slides. Security and data retention. So you're looking at in-place encryption technologies. Security has been built into the NetApp ONTAP operating system since its very inception. I mean, it's just part of our DNA. I'll talk a little bit here in a minute about F-policy, which is built into every single instance of ONTAP, whether it's running on a physical array or a cloud volumes ONTAP instance. It makes absolutely no difference where your data is. It's protected the same way. So that level of consistency is critical to being able to manage the security profile and really help protect from any vector, regardless of where your data resides. Multi-factor authentication, secure multi-tenancy, all factors within the NetApp portfolio to protect the data while it's online. In the recover space, there's a couple different kinds of recovery. You have operational recovery, which we would typically recommend that you would use. You recover from local snapshot copies. The data's there. It's already in native format. It's readily available. It's very fast. If you have to do a larger scale recovery, that's kind of where the tie-in with Rubrik comes in. You have the ability to restore data from your secondary copies, no matter where they are, whether they're in the cloud, on-prem. It doesn't make any difference. You have the ability to pull it back. And then, of course, disaster recovery. If you have to fail over application and data to a secondary location or to the cloud, again, to minimize an application outage, you can leverage the combination of technologies that both NetApp and Rubrik bring to the table to help make that a little bit simpler, easier, and above all, consistent. So you have the same type of operations. You're using the same tools, regardless of where your data resides. Easy for me to say. So at NetApp, we're kind of on the front line because this is where your data resides, and Rubrik is on the back end or the last line. It is just as critical. There's no difference in criticality or importance of where you protect your data. Whether you do it up front, you do it on the back end, you have to do it everywhere, and you have to do it consistently throughout your environment in order to get the results that you're looking for. So within the NetApp environment, within ONTAP, the first line of defense, we have a module called F-policy. It is NetApp's zero trust engine, and this is built into every single instance of ONTAP. Again, whether it's an all-flash array or a physical disk, or we're running up in the cloud, it makes no difference. It acts exactly the same way. And I think it's also worth pointing out that this is not a late-breaking tool or recently developed enhancement to improve the quality of your security profile. This has been built into ONTAP from the very beginning. It's just part of our DNA. Now, with F-policy, we're aware of every file operation on the system. So we have the ability to look at file and user behavioral analytics. We can integrate with third-party partners such as Varonis or other SIEM systems. It also operates in an internal mode. So every ONTAP customer, every ONTAP instance has the ability to use a native file blocking and where we'll simply deny the creation of restricted file types. And about 75% of the ransomware that's out there all encrypts the file and then writes it with some type of unique file extension or identifier. You can prevent that from happening right up front simply by making use of the capabilities that you have in every single instance of ONTAP with F-policy. And then if we want to get a little bit more detailed, with NetApp Cloud Insights, we have performance analytics. There's a module within that called Cloud Secure that monitors the access to the NetApp file systems, builds a normal, if you will, builds a profile of what normal behavior is within your environment. And then using that, once we have built the behavioral model for each user, we can easily identify abnormal behavior. So if there's excessive file access or file creation or anything like that, we can go ahead and detect that change right away and alert on that. And of course, right there is Rubrik. And the equivalence, with radar, you have the ability to detect any changes. And it's not just the ability to detect the changes, but you need to understand what has been affected by any attack that you catch once it's actually begun. So both Cloud Secure helps with that, also with forensic analysis. Radar also assists. And then, of course, Sonar, with regard to the content of the data. It takes the content of the data, kind of puts that in context. Is this sensitive data? Is this data subject to specific regulation? It helps you really understand what is the risk, what are the ramifications from this recent attack, being able to recover from it, so that you don't have any long-term repercussions. In this case, looking a little bit further within a typical ONTAP environment, we at NetApp recommend very frequent snapshots of your file systems. And snapshots, by their very nature, are immutable. It's a point in time, a recovery point. You cannot change it. It is, however, subject to deletion. So there is a write once, read many tool for that called SnapLock, where we can actually prevent the deletion of snapshots and ensure that they're available for rapid recovery. But everything else, end-to-end encryption within replication, data at rest encryption, multi-factor authentication, everything that you could look for is all part of the ONTAP operating system. And, it's all intended to work together in layers to provide a holistic security protocol and profile for each customer that is going to help protect your data and ensure business continuity, and that you don't have to pay the ransom. Some other areas, we have object storage offerings, Storage Grid, which works very well with our partner Rubrik. For archiving or even direct NAS backup, you have the ability to store a larger volume of data in a much more cost-effective architecture. Of course, when we're talking about immutability, Rubrik's file system itself is append only, right? So it is designed as an immutable file system. They also offer the retention lock for worm compliance on individual backups. Of course, then you have the benefit of separation of the data, and it doesn't make any difference where that data is written to. It's incredibly flexible, whether you want to write the data to another NAS target, to an object store, or out to cloud. You have all that same goodness, if you will, all of the same ease of management and orchestration within the environment. Again, for recovery, I would always recommend that we use local snapshots for operational recovery. We do have the ability to make a clone of those and use them for testing. In some cases, you might want to use that for a DR test. It doesn't require any break of a replication relationship or no impact on the production environment to do a test. And again, if you have to, if the local snapshots don't have a retention period that you were able to detect the attack within, you can always recover from the Rubrik data. And of course, they've got the indexing ability to help you find the data that you want instantly, regardless of what it's stored on. And then, there are some additional bells and whistles to really reduce your time to recover. The live mount to bring everything back online virtually immediately is extremely impressive, and we've got a lot of customers that are using that technology as well. Being able to get your data back up quickly where you need it, how you need it, is really what this is all about, leveraging the strengths of each company. One of the main benefits that we see with Rubrik on the NetApp side is simplicity. There's an incredibly broad range of applications that are supported, and it's all policy based. So it's very straightforward. It's easy to dial up or dial down, and it's It's incredibly flexible in terms of where do you write this data, whether it's on-prem, whether it be an object store or an NFS target, or whether you want to take it out to cloud, whatever is right for your organization, it can be configured to match your needs. Rubrik on backup is a little bit different than traditional backup vendors. They take a much more modern approach. Everything is API based. Basically, you only have to tell Rubrik 4 things. How often do you want the snapshots taken? How long do you want to keep them? If you want them archived, and if you want them replicated out someplace else. So it is the consistency and the reduction of the complexity that's offered by the automation that's really key here, because consistency leads to repeatability. And when you have a very consistent, repeatable process in place, it allows you to repeat your success across your environment, regardless of how many environments you have or whether they're on-prem or in the cloud. The two main factors that typically affect backup performance or data protection performance are density and capacity. With regard to density, from the NetApp perspective, we've got very high performing all flash arrays that can be extremely dense with regard to not taking up that much space. The secret sauce here is really Rubrik's ability to call an API and immediately determine what's changed. In this case, if you didn't have that, they would be crawling the file system. They would have to literally walk the file system in order to determine what data needs to be protected. And in this case, you don't have to do that. A simple API call, you determine what's changed. That way you know what needs to be protected, and you can immediately start moving that data across. And of course, capacity, scalability. Rubrik scales virtually infinitely. NetApp has extremely large capacity systems. Again, they scale very linearly. Rubrik has the ability to break the data set up into multiple chunks so that that parallelization of ingest is critical to really getting your backups done quickly and reliably. So like I said, it's a little bit different approach. I consider it a much more modern approach to data protection. It is not your grandfather's NDMP streaming backup, if you will. It's all API based. And with that, you get the native format backups, which when you're doing with snapshots, it truly is incremental forever. Once that initial backup is taken, we're only taking the data that's changed. And with Rubrik, you have the additional benefit of archive, a Google type global search, and more. So you really have that whole index and that single pane of glass to manage the replication pieces throughout your environment. One of the features within Rubrik is the ability to do a NAS Direct Archive. So this is one of the few companies, in fact, I can't think of any other company that's going to tell you, hey, this is how you spend less with us, right? If you take a look at the left side of this screen, the traditional NAS environment, let's say we've got 1.2 petabytes, there's billions of small files. Traditionally, it may have taken 7 bricks to land all that data and protect it in the Rubrik environment. When you start using things like NAS Direct Archive, you have a single brick, it's maintaining all the metadata, and everything else gets written out either to an on-prem object store or to a cloud, whatever's more cost effective, whatever the right fit is for the customer, but all at a reduced cost. And you still have all of the same search capabilities and management. Nothing changed other than where you're writing the data. This is extremely cost effective and beneficial to the customers that are able to take the advantage of it. When you take a look at, I mentioned the fact that Rubrik has the ability to call an API in NetApp ONTAP and immediately determine what's changed. Without that, and having to walk that file system just to figure out what changed, you're looking at in excess of 7 to 8 hours plus up to 14 hours, depending on the performance of your primary storage. How long is it going to take to just figure out what needs to be protected and then go ahead and start lifting and shifting the data? In this case, with that secret sauce between Rubrik and NetApp, we can get it down to under 8 minutes. So you go from at least 7 hours to under 7 minutes. That's a tremendous differentiator and a huge performance benefit to the clients. Your backup starts sooner, your backups finish sooner, you're protected sooner, and that's really what it comes down to. Key integration points. We take a look at the SnapMirror integration. Rubrik and NetApp have been working together for a couple of years now. We're continuing to move forward with integration between the two technologies. You have the ability now to shift the backup to the secondary so that we don't affect the production environment and leverage the Rubrik's direct archive capability. And you can write that data, again, anywhere that you want, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, and reduce the amount of spend and the amount of footprint that you have on backup data in the data center. So it's extremely effective. Going forward, NetApp has introduced what we now refer to as the SnapDiff version 3. It is part of our SnapMirror to cloud extension. So now you have the ability within ONTAP environments to extend those snapshots out to a cloud or an S3 target. Doesn't make any difference where that is. We take all of the storage efficiencies are preserved within that storage snapshot, and we can simply write it into an S3 target. And as such, it gives you a lot more flexibility. Again, you want to make sure that you retain more snapshots. Your retention period for your snapshots needs to be longer than your detection period for an attack. So we want to make sure that we have enough snapshots to go back and get back to a clean copy of the data. So if you think it's going to take 2 weeks, potentially 30 days to detect whether a ransomware attack or a malicious piece of code was actually present in the environment, you want to make sure that you have a greater period of time worth of recovery points, which is all a snapshot is a point in time that you can recover to. You want to make sure that you have a sufficient number of those recovery points to fall back to. With SnapMirror to cloud, you have the ability to store that data in a more cost-effective architecture as opposed to keeping them all on your primary storage and having what would in effect become a larger amount of inactive data on your primary storage. Here you can move it to some place where it's much more cost effective with Rubrik, very easily managed and readily accessible, and Rubrik can be the coordinator, manage and orchestrate that within your environment. So even as NetApp continues to move forward in the security space and extending the capabilities of our ONTAP file system, Rubrik is right there lockstep with us, supporting those additional features and making it easier for customers to use and integrate into their backup environment. So whether you're looking at the very front end with regard to data assurance and data integrity, whether you're looking at having a backup copy or a long-term archive, whether that's written in a private cloud, on-prem, or a public cloud outside at one of the hyperscalers, Rubrik and NetApp work together very well to really manage your data through the entire life cycle of its existence. So with that, I will go ahead and hand it off to Dimitra.
Thank you, Randy. Welcome everyone. So I'm going to talk about, we've seen a lot of information on data defense from both NetApp and Rubrik. And so I'm going to, in this talk from Blue Hexagon, we're going to discuss what happens prior to your data getting affected and looking at enterprise defense as a whole from a zero trust perspective. So if you look at the picture of how attackers are happening, you have NetApp from a data perspective, the first line of defense, and Rubrik is the last line of defense from a data perspective. From an enterprise perspective, whether it's on-prem in your data center or in your public cloud IaaS services, the key thing to think about is how are attackers getting in the first place? How are they moving around in your environment? How are they getting ready and prepped to go and actually attack the data and do what they want to do? And so that's what we'll discuss in this section of the presentation to give a bigger picture of defense in depth that goes all the way from your network cloud to your primary storage and finally to your backups. And I hope that gives a good perspective to all of you in terms of what it takes to protect an entire organization from ransomware attacks. So just a quick description of Blue Hexagon. We are a startup out of Silicon Valley. We are classified by Gartner as a network detection and response system. So we are an AI system that sits in the network, whether it's on premises or cloud, trying to detect threats or incursions that are happening inside your network, whether it's ransomware or other kinds of threats. And then we integrate with our partners in the ecosystem, both on the endpoint side, the firewall side, to try to blunt these attacks before they become resident. So as part of your defense in depth. And one of the reasons we're really at the forefront of the ransomware pandemic is because what's happening. If you look at the stats from 2019 to now, there's a new ransomware incident every 11 seconds. The time taken from incursion to ransom demands, in some cases, if you remember the Kaseya attack that happened recently, it happened on a Friday. Everything happened pretty quickly. In some cases, you have a ransom demand in 45 minutes. And we've also seen that the average downtime is actually been growing from 16 days to 21 days in the last 2 years, because everyone is not adapted to these kinds of newer technologies, as we discussed in the last two presentations. There's still a problem with being able to recover quickly. And the other issue that we're seeing is the attackers are getting better. They're more sophisticated. They're better at being deeper in the network. So they have multiple forms of leverage. It's not just data leverage. They also have downtime, disruption leverage. So all of these aspects make it harder for customers to defend themselves. So this is, as we say, the ongoing problem. So if you look at understanding why this happens is actually, is very important. The key point here to think about is that ransomware is really a multi-stage attack. We've talked a lot about the bottom of this section here, how data is encrypted, what are the different techniques attackers are using. They're going after the backup servers. They're looking at the backup protocols themselves, right? But a lot of stuff is happening even before all of that. For example, there's three main phases in ransomware. You have initial access, actually getting into your network, right? And there's three main ways to do that. One is phishing, right? Phishing has been around. It's not going to go away anytime soon. It keeps evolving to look more and more benign, so that you click on it. It's more relevant to current events to make you click on it. It uses more complex forms of malware to avoid detection on the endpoint side. So that remains one of the big vectors of people getting into your network and then trying to spread from there. The other big piece of initial access that we've seen in the last year is really external services. So you have all these gateways, VPN devices, firewalls, other things inside your network which have some vulnerabilities, and people are able to get in from the outside, and they're now in a privileged point in the network. If you look at what happened with the SolarWinds attack, the MS Exchange attacks this year, these are all examples of attackers being able to get into a privileged point in your network, and now they have access to your to move laterally, or even just take data from that specific server. And the third key trend we've seen this year is really the supply chain attack. We saw that with SolarWinds. We've seen that with the Kaseya attack. And in this case, it's really hard to defend because the attacker is already in, and they're actually in with very high privilege, such that they can actually hide their tracks and spread themselves inside the network before even encrypting or doing anything. The second phase in a ransomware attack after initial access, after you get in, is really consolidation. So it's not enough to just get into one place. You need to really figure out where are the NAS shares, where is all the important data in this enterprise. So you need to move laterally, you need to get more privilege, you need to talk back to your command center. So you have to do some kind of command and control or C2 so that the operators of the ransomware actually know what to do next. Many of the new ransomware attacks are actually human operated. They have a ransomware operations center. There are people sitting in looking at the network, trying to figure out what to do next. So it's a pretty sophisticated operation that happens for consolidation. And once consolidation is done, you then have the auctions and objective. And this is what's going to happen on right before the July 4th weekend on a Friday when it's hard to defend. That's when they'll go in and do the actions and objectives, which, as you see in the previous two talks, could be encrypting your shares, maybe going after the backups themselves if you don't have a system like Rubrik. One of the things we've seen commonly happening now because of the fact that people are investing in backup is also the fact that attackers are exfiltrating some of the data, so that even if you can recover from backups, they can try to get some of the ransom by saying, I'm going to name and shame you, I'm going to share this data externally. So it's important to think about not just encryption, but also stopping exfiltration and stopping disruption of your activities, both from a data perspective and from a network perspective. So if you look at the different techniques people are using here, it's important to consider that this is not just one thing. You really have to look at holistically at your entire enterprise. You will look at things like, how are my buckets being exposed? What kinds of vulnerabilities do I have? Looking at your malware and supply chain. From the C2 perspective, you have to look at what kind of tools are being seen on your network. And finally, from an actions and objective perspective, we talked about attackers are trying to encrypt data in the backups and NAS themselves. If you invest in solutions like NetApp and Rubrik, you reduce the risk of those kinds of things happening, right? But it's not pervasive yet. And the other thing attackers are doing is double extortion, where they'll try to encrypt and they'll try to exfiltrate some or all of the data and use that to gain leverage on the enterprise itself. So let's look at three key strategies that we think are very important for ransomware defense. And one of the things here, which is not always very evident or very intuitive, is really the fact that you need to stop generic infections early. Okay, so when ransomware happens, it's not that the ransomware just comes in and it happens. It's usually being done by in this sort of stage manner. You have these initial access brokers who are actually getting into networks, getting a foothold using phishing. So they basically coming in and they have residency on some or many of your devices, and then they sell access to that residency to ransomware affiliates, right? And these guys, the affiliates, are actually going to do the consolidation phase. So if you look at sophistication, the first set of actors here, the initial access brokers, may not be very sophisticated. They may be just trying to make a quick buck, but they're good at attacking new CVs, sending phishing emails, mutating malware. So they come in and infect your laptops or endpoints, but they don't do anything more. They may wait for a couple of weeks and they'll sell that access for some Bitcoin to these ransomware affiliates. The ransomware affiliates are really, they are the ones who are contracted with the actual ransomware operators like Ryuk or the big guys who are actually writing the real ransomware. And these guys are going to try to spread in your network using lateral movement. They'll try to figure out, let me stage myself at all the important points before I on that Friday, before I go in and encrypt everything or do something bad. So there are lots of places here where there are chances to disrupt the spread or limit the spread of where the ransomware will actually happen. And that's actually a very important way to understand. I mean, if you think about our human immune system, right? You have your nose that actually stops a lot of generic infections. Some of them may get in and lead to a deeper infection and get all the way to your heart or lungs, right? So you want to be stopping all these generic infections as early as possible to limit the risk of the deeper infection happening. And one thing to note is that these generic infections are always happening all the time. All of you are very aware there's thousands of phishing emails coming every day. There's new CVs being announced every single day. Many of them are unknown as well. So the key thing is to have this ability to keep this in check to reduce the risk of these things spreading further into your network. The second key principle we suggest, and this is seen both in NetApp and Rubrik, you need to use AI-based predictions. You need to use some machine learning anomaly detection to be able to really figure out this attacker behavior. It's very hard to use signatures, like for example, like file extensions or names, because they keep changing all the time. But looking at patterns of behavior is actually very, very critical, all the way in the network to the primary to the backup as well, to notice when attackers are doing weird things inside your system. And here's a good example. So this is the first ransomware in 2019 called Anatova. And when it first comes in here on the bottom of this graph, you see that a very few people are actually being able to detect this ransomware, probably 3 out of 70 vendors. And it stays like that for a long, long time. And it rises to this general conclusion much later when it's in the news. So people usually detect things when it's in the news, when someone's tweeting about it, because they're not using AI. Threat intelligence about hashes and IPs are really not sufficient to be able to detect these kinds of attacks effectively. This is another example, recently from this year, the MS Exchange vulnerability led to Dear Cry ransomware. And if you look at, Microsoft security tweet, it's basically saying on March 11th that, we've detected this new ransomware family being used post compromise on the MS Exchange, and you guys should start blocking it. But if you look at what happened on the right in VirusTotal, these samples were coming in 2 days earlier and with very, very low detections, right? Only on March 11th, when this tweet was sent out, people started detecting it. So the key thing to note, and remember, attackers are probably in even before this. So what's really happening in the industry is that all these attacks come in, people detect it after a couple of days, and at that point it's too late. And you really are only limited to your last line of defense, which is being able to recover from the backups. But you also you really need to figure out how to blunt the radius of these attacks. So if you can detect some of these things early, maybe they can only go after a few systems and not be really proliferating inside your enterprise. The third key point here is, you have to invest in detection and response, and even hunt for these kinds of threats. One of the, this is an interesting picture from a security researcher on Twitter. The traditional view is that, you have an attacker coming in, you have your data on the right, and you have all these different layers: firewall, proxy, IDS, VPN, etc., that's going to protect the data from being affected. What's actually happening is that, supply chain attacks and phishing breach the endpoint directly, and now you have an outbound command control connection, right? So all of these layers essentially fail, and that's what's really been happening, right? That's the reason why you have so many attacks. And so one thing to think about is you have to assume breach. As a defender, you have to assume that you're breached. You have to invest in detection and response versus prevention and relying on signatures, and try to figure out what are the different behaviors that you might see in your network as the attack is progressing, right? All the way from the network side to trying to do the consolidation phase, all the way to the encryption phase. And all of these are visible if you've invested in detection and response at all stages of your defense, right? And this is the reason why having things like F policy or sonar and radar that we talked about on the Rubrik side, all of these machine learning tools help you identify these different patterns of attacks that attackers may be coming in all the way from your network to your data as well. So what Blue Hexagon does, how the way we do this in a zero trust way is really to focus on agentless deployment. So we don't deploy agents. We like to stay outside of the endpoint. We monitor from the network, or in the cloud, we use SaaS-based APIs to monitor workloads, network storage logs, all of these for signs of activities prior to the actual data being affected. So it gives you that defense in depth at the first stage. And with that, you get visibility into what's happening, threat defense, as well as compliance for your entire IT real estate, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud. And all of these detections can lead to orchestrations with our many partners on the endpoint and the network side. And essentially, the way we deploy a solution, Blue Hexagon, is using cloud-native APIs on AWS, like traffic mirroring, or getting SaaS access to all the logs. Similarly, in GCP, and as well as in Azure, we also have physical appliances that can go into your data center to look at both the north, south, and east-west traffic for all these kinds of threats that are coming in for ransomware. And finally, we also can monitor your applications and SaaS through query APIs, looking at Office 365. And so this is really looking at is someone putting a malware there? Is there some weird behavior in terms of who's accessing what kinds of objects? And all of these help you with that earlier enterprise defense from ransomware. So I hope I gave you a good picture of looking at ransomware defense from a wide angle, looking at how things get in from the very beginning, whether it's in your network or in your cloud, how they then proliferate to your primary storage, and how NetApp talked about how you can protect that with F policy and other cloud insights. Finally, going to immutable storage and recovery from Rubrik to be able to recover things and not letting the attacker be able to change those kind of services as well. So with that, I'll give it off to David for Q&A.
Great presentation. Really appreciate that. I learned a lot. It's now time for our Q&A. We've got a lot of great questions here coming in. So thank you everyone in advance for those questions. If you have a question, now's the time to get it in. We are going to bring up this poll question for everyone out there in the audience. We want to get your feedback on this. The question is, what additional information would you like about the Rubrik, NetApp, and Blue Hexagon solution? And of course, this is a multi-select question, so feel free to select more than one option there. The first question here, I believe, looks like this one's for you, Murthy. They're asking about what are the unique capabilities that Rubrik provides, and then are the Rubrik file systems immutable?
That's a great question. So, I mean, the simple answer is yes. That's almost sort of table stakes these days, because especially as we have been talking about in a world of ransomware attacks, last thing you want is file systems to be easily alterable. And so, absolutely, we have a very sophisticated kind of immutable file system. But on top of that, there's a lot of other capabilities that are sort of beyond just the table stakes. Like I mentioned, we have this entire architecture. And I just mentioned a couple of the capabilities beforehand that really kind of prevent attackers from getting into the backup system, which is very, very important. That's sort of one part of the equation. The other part of the equation is the incident response side of things. Like, how do you actually use the data that's in there to understand scope of attack, potential for sensitive data, so that you can kind of accelerate your response as well.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, there are quite a few questions out here around immutability. So thank you for sharing that with us. Here's a question for you, Sumitra. They're asking, with many of the recent ransomware incidents, they were multi-stage. So when's the best time in the kill chain to disrupt an attack related to ransomware?
So my solution around this really is to focus on all the stages, right? I mean, I know I'm not picking a side, but really you have to focus on defense in depth, all the way from how things are entering your network, how they're consolidating, looking at that, how they're writing to primary storage, and looking at things that NetApp talked about as policy, finally to the backup themselves, because you can't really be certain, nobody can provide a guarantee of 100% efficacy, right? I know there's marketing out there that does that, but really to protect yourself, you need to invest in detection and response along all of these three axes. And you can't leave all your eggs in one of the baskets. That's the key thing, because if you don't have too much on your network and cloud side, then you have too many infections coming in, and you're constantly worrying about what to do with your backups, right? And vice versa. So really the goal is to invest in all of these three pieces equally, and focus on detection and response. Prevention hasn't worked, or we wouldn't have all these problems that we're having right now.
I like that. Yeah, defense in depth. Absolutely. Next question for you, Randy. They are asking, how can we protect our NAS filers and manage our data better? Any advice there?
Well, I think you're looking for a solution like Rubrik, something to give you that single pane of glass and ease of use regardless of where your data is located. That question requires a little bit more information and specifics about the environment. So I would encourage you to reach out to either your Rubrik or NetApp or Blue Hexagon team, and let's set up a future conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm afraid we're running out of time here in our live event. We've got a ton of great questions coming in. I appreciate everyone submitting those. We'll have to get back to those after the event electronically. But this has been a really eye-opening, really educational event. I want to thank our, our expert presenters, Murthy from Rubrik, Randy from NetApp, and Dr. Sumitra Das from Blue Hexagon. Thank you all so much for being on the webinar today.
Thank you. Pleasure.
And of course, thank you to everyone out there in the audience for joining us on the webinar. I hope that you will check out the handouts tab there before you go for additional resources, the excellent case study about Lang's building supply, the Modernizing Defenses for Ransomware guide, and the best practices guide for preparing and recovering from a ransomware attack. Don't forget to submit your response there on the poll. And of course, it's now time to announce the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card, $300 gift card. This gift card is going out to Tony Tacano from California. Congratulations, Tony Tacano from California will also reach out to our best question prize winner. Thank you to, of course, everyone out there in the audience who joined us on the webinar today. I hope you learned a lot about zero trust ransomware defenses. I know that I did. I encourage you to check out Rubrik, NetApp, and Blue Hexagon for additional information on what you learned on the webinar. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.